Welcome to the Attack the Rack podcast. I am your host, Curtis Leslie, and you are tuning in to the number one rated podcast on the planet by people that rated it number one. All right, we have another special guest today here in the Get to Two Media Studios for the Attack the Rack podcast. And I know what you're saying. I know what you're thinking. You know, I always say I have a special guest, but the facts are the facts. I'm not lying. Every guest I have is a special guest. Today being no exception, we have Chad Carlson. Chad is a professor at Hope College in West Michigan. He's a former basketball coach, and he is an author, and he also is part of a really, really neat podcast called Sport.Faith.Life. And today we're going to dive into sport and faith. Before we get into this conversation with Mr. Chad Carlson, we need to take a second to thank the sponsor of the program today. Today's sponsor is Pancakes for Dinner. Pancakes are good at any meal, not just breakfast. Let's not forget about them during dinner. Go out and grab some pancakes for dinner tonight. All right. Welcome back to the Attack the Rack podcast. This is episode 16. We are joined today here in the Get to Two Media Studios by Chad Carlson. Chad, you have a really great podcast. You know, I really enjoyed listening to. I love how you start out your podcast, and we'll get into your podcast in detail later on. The main focus of your podcast is sport and faith. When you start out your podcast, you start with a couple questions you ask your guests. I'm going to ask you those questions.
Okay.
First question, what is sport meant to you in your life?
Yeah, right. It's hard for me to overstate how much sport has meant to me and how much a part of my life it has been. I, grew up playing sports. I mean, like so many kids did, continued playing high school and college. Got into coaching afterwards, and that didn't seem to be the right career path for me. So now I study sport, and so I feel like I've taken a number of different angles looking at sport. Of course, I'm a parent now of a young athlete, and so that comes with a whole lot of other perspectives on sport too. But I feel like my experiences with sport, continue. It's just a different frame now from which I view sport, and that's as a teacher and a researcher.
All right, and then next question. What is faith meant to you in your life?
Yeah, so the podcast we do is Sport.Faith.Life, and it's exactly that. We're spending time with people who at the intersection of sport and faith, and my Christian faith has been a part of my life, since as long as I can remember as well. And so that's something that's always driven me and been a motivating factor for me. So my faith has been central to who I am, and I probably can't overestimate the value of that in my life either.
All right, Chad, similar to many of the guests I've had on the program here, including your younger brother, Jeff Carlson. He is the varsity basketball coach at Zeeland East High School in West Michigan. Had him on a few weeks ago. I'll post the link to that interview in the description for this one for your friends and family who would also like to hear what Jeffrey had to say. But similar to everyone I've had on this program here, I have a long history with. You and I went to the same elementary school. We grew up in the same area of beautiful Holland, Michigan. I was a grade ahead of you. It wasn't like we hung out a ton in elementary school, middle school, but when we got into high school, we really became close friends. You were, as a ninth grader, brought up to the JV team, which, as you know, I was a sophomore. I was on that team as well, and that's really where we kind of started to connect, hang out, become friends. And then obviously 2 years playing together on the varsity basketball team as well. And speaking of that, Chad, as we're sitting here, we have in the background playing a classic Holland High School basketball game from December of 1999 up in the Traverse City tournament, your senior year, your Holland High Dutch playing against, I believe they are ranked number one,
Yeah.
one or two, Saginaw Arthur Hill, featuring Mr. Basketball, future MSU star, future NBA star Jason Richardson. And you guys pulled off one heck of an upset in this game. And this is probably one of the two, most classic Holland High victories in history. What was it like playing, not only in this game and pulling this major upset, but you guys had a great team that year. What was that like?
Yeah, I'm having a hard time focusing here because getting into this game, watching it. Jason Richardson was, you knew at the time, a very special player. Watching him just take a jump shot there and actually miss it, thanks to our defense, of course. That was our calling card that season. I mean, we won a lot of games with low scores, and most of it was because we just played hard on defense, didn't give up a lot of second chance opportunities, played a zone that teams had a hard time figuring out, played some full court press, and was just watching a minute ago, myself and another guy sort of ripped the ball from Jason Richardson and then take it in for a layup. I mean, just doesn't happen a lot, except that we played this unique style of defense. So, credit to our coach, Coach Worley, who did a wonderful job of preparing us for not only this game, but in the entire season. And we had a great season that year, ranked top 5 in the state most of the year. So that was a great experience. And I mean, so proud of that, so proud of what we accomplished. That game really, I think, set the standard for us that year of what we could do. And I think also set a standard for the program and what the expectations were going to be year in, year out. So pretty special game. I think we were probably underestimated. and as I'm watching here, I hit a 3. I didn't realize I hit any 3s that game. I know I scored a few points there, but we were a bunch of 6'3" guys, and that just sort of played hard, but weren't outstanding offensively. Shot a lot of 3s, and the games that we made a lot of 3s, we won easily. Games that we didn't, we won close. And yet we're playing against Jason Richardson here, who had already committed to Michigan State, and like I said, was about to win Mr. Basketball, would go on to a 15-year NBA career, back-to-back NBA dunk champion. I mean, that guy could just jump out of the gym, right? And then they had another guy going Division I, who was a junior that year, another big guy, and then their point guard who was tough to handle. So, they were coming in, I think, thinking they were going to walk all over us, and it didn't happen that way. Thanks in part to, I think, some resilience on our part. Our basic game plan was, if a shot goes up from Saginaw, Arthur Hill, 2 guys are going to box out Jason Richardson, and everybody else just go get the rebound, right? I mean, we just didn't. I mean, he was so good around the rim and so good at chasing offensive glass, and so we prevented that from happening. Like, he had 0 dunks, he didn't have a lot of offensive rebounds, and we put in just enough points to be able to win.
Yeah, and you just mentioned 0 dunks. I mean, that's a comment that is made a lot when you talk about this game. The fact that Jason Richardson had 0 dunks in this game, and Chad, I was a freshman in college at this point now, and I made the trip up to Traverse City with some friends and watched the game, and it was just awesome. And you guys did get down a couple times, double digits or close to it, and you just never quit. And just an awesome game, awesome moment in the history of Holland High School basketball. And then from there, Chad, you went on to play basketball at Hope College, also similar to a handful of the guests we've had so far. How did you like your experience playing college basketball?
I had a great experience at Hope, for sure. I mean, I had grown up, living and dying with Hope basketball as a fan, as a kid. And so that was always, in my mind and in my world, a bigger deal than probably what it was to most people. But that was something that always motivated me, was, to be able to play at Hope. And to be able to play in the program that I had grown up watching. So that was a big deal. And I think I probably took for granted how special it was that, the whole basketball program was such community support, leading the nation Division III in attendance every year. I mean, it's a special thing, right? And so you're playing the game, and it's so much more fun to play in front of fans. And across the country, Division III, I think the average attendance at games is, probably under 500. I mean, it's just maybe even under 100.
I'm sure overall the Division III,
for sure. Yeah. So I mean, pretty low numbers. So then, here we are playing in front of, we played in front of 2,500 fans per game, and it was, it would be double that for the Calvin game every year. And so it was a lot of fun, playing in a great, in front of a great community, playing for a great program. We won a lot of games. I think felt really good about the relationships we built and the school we were representing when we played. So yeah, certainly a wonderful experience.
Yeah, and then you after graduating, you did get into some coaching, and as you mentioned earlier, you felt like that wasn't your calling. What did you coach?
Yeah, so I coached for 3 years after I graduated at Hope, the JV team, and then when I was out in Pennsylvania for a few years, I spent one season as an assistant coach at Penn State Altoona, which is a Division III school. And then just recently, after having come back here to Hope College, coached the JV team again for another 4 years, and that was from 2014 to 2018. So spent some time doing that. JV level is interesting. I always compared myself to, I would make a joke, comparing myself to John Calipari, because, the two of us were in the business of coaching a whole new crop of guys every year that we knew we were only going to have for 1 year,
yes.
And then they move on something else. And so the whole idea, like, JV basketball, like what Coach Cal had for a while when he was having all those one and dones, was you just got to get guys play together,
right?
And buy into what you're trying to teach for 1 year, because there's not a long-term goal for any of those guys.
Absolutely. Right there. Yeah. All right, Chad. Well, hey, let's get into the topic today. I want to dive into the podcast that you have. I was fortunate enough to interview your brother a few weeks ago, and he mentioned to me that you had the podcast and mentioned, hey, why don't you, get with Chad and get some advice and, his thoughts on how to kind of be successful in this realm. And that made me think, I would love to have Chad as a guest on my podcast. After, finding out about your podcast, I started listening, and it's great. It's a really great, really well done podcast. Great topics, great guests. And then that made me think back. I remember a few years ago, you published a book.
I did.
You want to talk about that book a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Happy to talk about the book. It's called Making March Madness, and it's basically history of college basketball postseason tournaments. So published in 2017. It's a process, writing a book, and especially an academic book, is something that like professors like me do. Like it's not in our spare time. It's stuff that we're expected to do, that type of thing. But it takes a while, right? I mean, in the midst of teaching and service expectations, my job. So it took 5 or 6 years to write.
Wow.
And, it was a lot of research. The first part of it is like going to different libraries and different archives and trying to find all the documentation that I needed to be able to know what the story was of the early years of college basketball postseason tournaments, and then in actually writing it. So it took a lot of time, but the basic gist of it is, we've got one tournament that everybody knows about right now. It's the NCAA, right, postseason tournament, March Madness. And yet it was not, it was one of the early tournaments, but it was actually the third one on the scene. So, the NIT, everybody knows the NIT, which is the not invited tournament now, to say, right? It's the losers tournament. That one was actually started a year before the NCAA tournament.
Okay.
And in fact, the original one that's been ongoing is the NAIA tournament. So that one started a year before the NIT. So that was 1937, NIT was 38, NCAA was 39. So we've got this 3-year period where 3 new tournaments cropped up. And so I wanted to take a look at the early years of those tournaments and figure out how is it that the NCAA came to be the most prominent, like by a long shot, right? I mean, it's no question right now what the biggest tournament is. It's the NCAA tournament. But originally in the late 30s, when these 3 all came about, there had been nothing before that. And then you have these three, and all three of them were sort of jockeying for, market share, to see who could be the most prominent tournament, who could get the best teams. And it was not the NCAA right away. And in fact, people think that it was the NIT for longer than it actually was. I was arguing a little bit differently. But it took a few years for the NCAA tournament to establish itself and to be really seen as a legit annual tournament. So that's what I'm looking at. It's really from the late 30s to the early 50s when there was a big gambling scandal. And that sort of changed the landscape of college basketball. But looking at the late 30s and 40s and early 50s and how the NCAA tournament came about and came to be so popular.
Okay, so you brought up something there that I was unaware of. I was aware a little bit of the history of the NIT tournament. I was unaware the NIA. Did you say the NIA tournament started first?
Yeah, the NAIA
And
tournament. Yeah.
okay, so those are, at least today, obviously, those are two different entities. You've got the NCAA, and then you have the NI or the NAIA. Was it the same then?
Right. That's a great question. So the NCAA existed at the time as an entity itself, but it was really an entity just to sort of try to standardize rules for each sport for college. And so they didn't really they didn't host a lot of championships. In fact, they only had a couple, like a track and field one, a swimming one, and one other, maybe golf and cross country at the time, right? So there wasn't big money there. There wasn't big postseason events that the NCAA hosted. They were there to promote rule standardization for sports, for college sports. So then this guy out in Kansas named Emil Liston, he was the coach at Baker University in Kansas, decides, he wants to host this tournament. It's an open tournament for any team from across the country, and he wanted it to be a 32-team event, and they'd play one game per day, so 5-day tournament. And so that one started as an 8-team tournament that he piloted in 37. But the NAIA was not an organization at the time. That was not an entity itself. It was just, and so he called it the National Intercollegiate College Basketball Tournament first, and then the National Association of Intercollegiate Basketball Tournament is what it ended up becoming, as he made it an entity 2 years later.
Okay.
So that one started first, yeah, but that's
Wow.
that's the smallest one now.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I mean, there's so few schools that are NAIA schools anymore.
Yeah.
The NAIA wasn't an entity, like I said, in the late 30s, but they had this tournament, and then it became an entity around that basketball tournament.
Okay.
And that happened throughout the course of the 1940s.
Okay. And then Chad, where did this idea come from to write this book and this topic?
Yeah. So I was in a research intense grad program, and one of the things you do in that type of program is you try to ask good research questions and figure out where you can sort of find your voice in the midst of the existing scholarship that's out there. And in the world of sports studies, there's a lot of guys, mostly men, but a lot of people that have studied the Olympics. That seems to be the number one thing. A lot of people have studied college sport, but that focuses on football because it's always football that's driven the college sport enterprise. A lot that wrote about baseball because historically it's been the national pastime and the one that really kind of drives the American public. Pro football was not a big deal until really the second half of the 20th century. But then people started glomming onto that. Not a lot of people had written about college basketball. And so I just kind of thought, geez, I love college basketball.
Yeah.
It seems to be an open area where there's not a whole lot of research. And so I started getting into it and just thought, boy, March Madness is such a big deal, from a gambling perspective and all that. It's a huge thing. And yet nobody's written about the origins of it. Further, there was a misconception, at least that I was trying to get after. So people that know college basketball history a little bit will say the NIT was bigger than the NCAA event, at least until this gambling scandal in 1951, and maybe even after that. And so I was trying to sort of relook at that and say, well, when was it really that the NCAA tournament kind of became a bigger deal than the NIT? And it was actually during World War II, is my argument. So what was interesting is that during World War II, so you had these two sort of tournaments for big schools. So that's the NIT and the NCAA tournament. The NAIA tournament had very quickly become a tournament for smaller schools. Mm-hmm. And so they'd all go and play in that one. But the bigger schools would go to either the NIT tournament, if they were invited, you had to be invited to that one, or the NCAA tournament. And that one was chosen by the districts. And at the time, it was only eight teams in the tournament. Right now, we got 68. It's grown, which is college football is going to grow too, that tournament. But you had only 8 teams, and you had to win your district basically to be able to get in the NCAA tournament. So we had these two tournaments that were both sort of competing for prestige. They both, during World War II, happened to have their semis and their finals at Madison Square Garden in New York City. And so in the course of World War II, the organizers of the Red Cross connected with the guy that ran Madison Square Garden and said, well, why don't we have a playoff game between the two tournament champions and have all the proceeds go to the Red Cross War Fund? And that sounded like a great idea. So 1943 is the first time they did this, and they packed Madison Square Garden, and it was the NIT champ, which was St. John's, so a local school. And then the NCAA champ was Wyoming, University of Wyoming,
wow.
like of all teams, right?
Yeah.
This place from the middle of nowhere. They played on in a gym that they called Hell's Half Acre because nobody wanted to go there, and it was terrible. So anyways, Wyoming ends up beating St. John's, right?
Wow.
The local team, which was predicted to win by a lot.
Right.
So the NCAA champ won. 1944, NCAA champ Utah who actually lost first round of the NIT that same year, beat St. John's, repeat winner of NIT. And then 1945, the NCAA winner wins again. This time it's Oklahoma State, was Oklahoma A&M, and they beat DePaul from Chicago. So each of these times you have the tournament champion from NIT and NCAA matching up. NCAA tournament champ wins each of those years in New York City, which is sort of the mecca of basketball. And so that's where we start to see the idea that the NCAA tournament actually came into its own and became a better tournament than NIT.
Sure. Now, speaking of the NCAA tournament, men's basketball tournament, March Madness, there is now some talk of them expanding to 90 teams.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
It's inevitable.
Okay.
I mean, it's always grown, right? So it started as an 8-team tournament, and they bumped up to 16, and then it was like between 24 and 27 for a number of years. Then it was 32 in 1975. They bumped it up to 64, and I think it was 1985, and 64 for a while. Now, I mean, 90.
That is.
Are you kidding me?
Wow.
That's crazy. That's a big jump.
Yeah, it is.
But the idea is that you're giving more and more teams access to the championship. It's kind of it's a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, right? I mean, for most teams, there's no shot at the championship, but you're getting more teams on the big stage.
Yeah.
You're making more money for the NCAA and its member schools through March Madness tournament. So yeah, I think it's inevitable.
Yeah. All right. Hey, one thing, you mentioned a couple times this gambling scandal back in, what'd you say, 1951?
Yeah.
What was that about?
Right. So you have, you can't pay college athletes, right? And that's a difficulty. So you've got all of these teams that really want to play at Madison Square Garden because that's where you get promoted. That's where you get the best press, right? That's really because you're not televising games in the 30s and 40s. So everyone wants to play in Madison Square Garden. Well, Madison Square Garden is also a den of gamblers at the time. I mean, that's right. It's big bookie country there. So you get all these teams of these impressionable, college guys from all over the country. Some that are just like total country rubes, and they show up, and you go and on your way to the game, you walk through the inner workings of Madison Square Garden, and even to get there, it's kind of a seedy part of New York City, or at least it was at that point in time. And you got to walk past all these gamblers, right? And so these guys that would basically tell a player, a star player of a particular team, I don't need you to lose the game. I just need you to stay under the point spread, and I'll pay you $1,000.
Yeah.
And the kid's making no money,
right?
And so, but yet it's a big deal. And a lot of times, the teams that the gamblers got to were their local New York City teams, where the kids were steeped in the gambling culture. I mean, it was just part of everyday life, or teams that had a lot of poor kids from the country in the Midwest that were naive.
Yeah.
So University of Kentucky, Bradley University had a bunch of guys implicated. And so the idea was these are good teams. So Kentucky would come and they would have this huge point spread, right? So they're gonna kill the team that whoever they're playing, and the bookies would say, you don't need to lose the game,
right?
But just maybe a few turnovers late, miss a few shots late, make sure that you win by less than the point spread, and I'll give you $1,000.
Sure, and that did happen again with Arizona State basketball in the mid '90s. There's a phenomenal documentary on that on Netflix. Same thing, the bookies or the guy running the scam is like, you don't got to lose, just don't win by X or more points.
Right.
So
that happened in 51. That happened in 61.
Okay.
I mean, it has happened, and I think that's when someone asks me, well, should we pay college athletes? Like that's one of the things that comes to my mind is, that's going to actually help the purity of the actual on-court action, right? Because if you have these kids that are worth know that they're net,
Right.
they're worth millions of dollars for their skills, but they're not paid a dime.
Right.
You're not paying them at all.
Right.
Well, they might seek money in black market means. And so
Sure.
actually Kentucky had this amazing team that won the NCAA tournament in 1948. 1949, they had this unbelievable year. They get into the NIT and they lose against all odds. What happened is they had, like, their players were getting money from gamblers
Sure.
and actually sucked at, like, shaving points that game and lost. Well, they went on to win the NCAA tournament that year and would have won both. And that would have been a historic event.
Yeah.
But all their guys had gotten roped in by gamblers.
Okay, so I was going to ask you about this. I've heard of this too, where there's back then a team could get knocked out of the NIT tournament, and then the NCAA would pick them up to have them join their tournament.
So it happened a few times, really only a handful of times throughout the course of history, because there was only a few-year period before the NCAA basically abolished that practice. But a team could go into both. And in fact, in 1950, City College of New York won both tournaments, the double.
Yep.
The only time any team's ever won the double. Kentucky would have done it in 49 had gamblers not gotten to their guys.
Sure.
So there are a few times when teams played in both. And it was especially easy. So the entire NIT was always at the Madison Square Garden at the time. And the NCAA tournament, first round action would be somewhere, but then semis and finals would be at Madison Square Garden. So it'd be easy for a team to just plan itself in New York City and play in both.
Okay.
But that did happen for a few years. And then the NCAA got powerful enough to be able to say, if you are an NCAA member and you're offered a spot, you need to take it.
Sure. Okay.
Otherwise, like, you're out of the organization.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's some great history of March Madness. Certainly, one of the top sporting events in America, if not the world.
Sure.
I love it. I mean, it's my favorite time of year. Those 3 weeks at the end of March. Just amazing basketball, amazing tournament. All right, let's segue now into this podcast.
Sure.
That you've got. It's Sport, Faith, and Life. Where did the idea for that come from?
There's two guys in England that in 2016 decided they were going to host an event called the Inaugural Global Congress on Sport and Christianity. And it's for people who are studying sport and Christianity like myself. It's for people that are like team chaplains or doing sports ministry from all over the world. They want everyone to get together and sort of spend time talking to each other. So they hosted that event. And at the end of that event, which I attended and presented at, along with a guy at Calvin named Brian Bolt, afterwards, because Calvin had a connection with the university that hosted that first one, the guys that were running it said to my colleague at Calvin, hey, why don't you host the next one in Grand Rapids in 2019? And so he said, well, I can do it, but I'm going to need some help. And so he reached out to me and said, hey, will you help me co-host this? So we did. And in part of our marketing efforts to that 2019 event, we started this podcast called Sport.Faith.Life and decided we were going to interview people who are at the intersection of sport and faith. And we've been doing that ever since. We've got more than 80 episodes now. We put out one every other week. And it's been a blast to do, as I'm sure you're sort of, scratching the itch. It's just fun to do podcasts and fun to talk to people and record it and to see where conversations go. So, we interview guests for most of our episodes, not all of them, but most. And, as you're becoming aware too, like the quality of a podcast episode is a lot of times based on the guest, right? And the insight that the guest can bring to the conversation. So pumped about what you're doing because of that, because I think there's this growing appetite for podcasts. Just to be listening to something while you're doing the dishes or while you're driving to work or whatever else.
Absolutely.
It's a great way to get ideas out there and spark conversations.
Yeah, no, for sure. How long have you guys been doing that?
We started in 2018. We really sort of made a push after we hosted the second Global Congress on Sport and Christianity in October 2019. So we're really 3 years into doing this kind of regularly. And like I said, we're more than 80 episodes in now. We've had guests from all over the world, which has been a challenge at times to connect with spotty wireless or spotty internet access in certain parts of the world, and having a hard time with some of that. But the ideas are there, and that's what's so fun about it, is just getting to talk to people about sport and faith and about the ways in which they engage at the intersection of sport and faith. And So like we talked to one guy, one of our early episodes, it's just a fascinating guy. He's born in the U.S., but became a missionary, like 25 years old. He moves down to Colombia in South America, to the city of Medellin, which in the early 80s became the drug capital of the world. So he goes down there and basically feels called to do missionary work to convert drug dealers, like Pablo Salazar's guys, to convert them to becoming like ministry leaders. And so he does that, and he does it through soccer. So he can't, like, he sees these guys on the street that are trying to sell drugs or are killing people for Pablo Salazar and
Pablo Escobar.
Pablo Escobar, right,
Yes,
right. Pablo
yes,
Escobar.
yep, sure.
And there's these two. What's the two Escobars? What's that ESPN?
ESPN 30 for 30 on the two Escobars.
Yeah.
Yes, one was about Pablo Escobar, the drug lord,
and then there's the Andres Escobar, the soccer player.
Yes.
Okay. So it's been a few years since I watched that, since I talked to this guy. But the reason I'm bringing it up is because it's such a fascinating story. So this guy's taken Pablo Escobar's like kingpins and trying to proselytize to him. And he says, "Hey, why don't you come join me for Bible study?" And they're like, "Get out of here. No way." And he's like, "Well, how about if we play soccer?" "Great. You got it." Like, so they start playing soccer in these soccer leagues. And then these guys come to know Christ through playing soccer. And they say, "Well, we want to become Christians, but if we do that, we lose our very lucrative jobs for Pablo Escobar, selling drugs and being his hitman." Like,
Right.
I mean, that pays them a lot of money.
Yeah.
So this guy named Marcos, this American missionary, thinks, well, let's see. My wife makes really good brownies. How about if we start a company making brownies? So he invites these guys that used to be Pablo Escobar's workers, and they come in and they make money by, he creates this brownie and cookie making company that he still has going on today, 30 years later, with all these guys that he takes off the streets and says, come to be Christians and then work for us, and then also coach soccer. So he's got this burgeoning soccer league now, over 2,000 teams that play in it.
Wow.
He's got an entire stadium that they got built through the money that they made by selling brownies and cookies. He was also able to employ all these guys and take them off the streets and away from selling drugs. I mean, it's just a fascinating story of how soccer could change things down in Colombia.
Wow. Wow. My mind is blown by that. Wow.
All right, we're going to take a quick break, and then we will come right back with more of the Attack the Rack podcast. And we are back.
All right, so Sport and Faith, in 2023 now, how do you see faith in sports? And I guess that comes from, my question comes from, I see today, I remember when we were growing up, and when you found out an athlete was a Christian, it was like the coolest thing. Like, oh, wow, that's great. I feel like now there's a little bit of a negative stigma to that. I look at a guy like Kirk Cousins, and I look at a guy like Tim Tebow, very vocal about their Christianity and their beliefs and their faith. And I sense in this day and age that we now live in, that's almost looked at as a negative.
Yeah, there's definitely that pushback for sure. I think part of it is because I think athletes at times have used Christianity to promote like their own brand, and it comes across as disingenuous. I mean, I think the two examples you gave, Tim Tebow and Kirk Cousins, like, it's not, right? Clearly those guys, like, their Christian faith is the number one thing in their lives. I think that's a part of it. I think the other thing is it gets a little bit watered down, because we have a lot of athletes that as soon as they make a good play, they'll point up to the heavens, kiss their fingers and point up to the heavens, or make a cross on their chest or whatever else. And so that happens more regularly now, and it's less like, wow, it's less awe-inspiring when it happens, because it happens so often. What we're really trying to do is actually getting people to think deeply about the connections between sport and the Christian faith, and also some of the antipathies between sport and the Christian faith, right? Sometimes it's really hard to be a Christian in sporting cultures. And so we're trying to we're trying to work through some of those conversations, and it's less about like what happens in the moment and who can be the first one to respond to a news item. We just don't operate that quickly. It's more about getting people who have like given their lives to thinking about the intersection of sport and Christianity, or work at the intersection of sport and Christianity. And so that's really our target audience.
Right. I think it was the last episode that you had, your guest brought up that high school football coach in the state of Washington just would kneel and pray after every game, and slowly but surely others would join him, but there was no pressure. He wasn't imposing his beliefs on others, and he lost his job for that. And now and this literally had to go all the way to the United States Supreme Court for him to be able to get his job back.
Crazy.
It is.
One of our most recent guests mentioned that, and what's interesting about that guy, this is Terry Shoemaker, who's a professor at Arizona State. There are a lot of people that study religion, and they're religious studies professors like he is, that really don't come at it from their own personal faith standpoint. They're like sociologists studying religion in America, and so what that means to people and to groups of people. And so that's what's of interest to a lot of people here too. And so one of Terry's colleagues who has worked in a number of different places in the South wrote this great book called Game Day and God. It's about college football in the South, how that is a religion.
Yeah.
And they walk alongside sort of everything that the South has stood for historically. Like that's a part of the revelry of college football. So it's interesting to see how, to see the wide variety of ways that people engage themselves at the intersection of sport and Christianity. Sometimes it's through the law and our rights as citizens with public prayer after sporting events. Sometimes it has to do with sort of the culture of how we consume sport, and how so much of like the pageantry of college football follows the same lines of what our worship does, where there's certain rituals that we follow, and there's mass things that we say and sing, and we all stand at the same time, and we all sit down,
right.
And then we hug or shake hands with people that we otherwise don't really care about, throughout the rest of the week.
Yeah.
So there's all those types of intersections. There's also things like, studying professional athletes or big time athletes who are themselves Christians, and so following along. And one of the big questions is like, is Steph Curry really a Christian? Like this guy that seems to be a really good guy by NBA standards, and has said he's a Christian. Does he live it out? And so sometimes people are willing to like take a look at that. I mean, and that's the sort of the Tim Tebow model. That guy. People were always trying to poke holes in him and follow one misstep. Did he? Yeah. What did he do? How did he date his girlfriend? Did he ever sleep with a girl before he got married?
Right.
Some of those things. And so, I mean, that's what the public consumes and what they want to talk about. And really, what we're trying to get at is like the deeper meaning structures that are at play here. And so, there's a whole group of sports chaplains around the world that have psychology backgrounds.
Okay.
That are really trying to help walk alongside elite athletes to get them from the performance-based ethic, that is, their self-worth is based on how they perform, towards sort of a different model. The idea that, especially for these chaplains who are themselves pastors, to be able to say like, no, you're worthwhile no matter how you perform. We want you to do your best. We know you want to do your best, but if you don't get on the podium at the Olympics, like there's no shame in that, right? As long as you worked hard. So we're trying to get away from this performance-driven ethic and into a much more healthy mindset. And so you try to do that at elite levels, and that's what sports chaplains are doing. And in fact, a guy that I know who lives in Germany, actually he's American, but just got hired on by a soccer team in the Bundesliga, so a pro soccer team in one of the top 3 leagues in the world, that say, well, we want our guys to be living well, right? We don't want them to feel like they have to live in fear of having to perform well in order to be good. We feel like they're going to actually perform better if they're happier. So it's kind of like a happiness coach.
Okay.
But really what he's doing is essentially bringing in biblical principles, the idea that like you're loved no matter what. We care about you, and God loves you no matter what.
Yep.
And also God has given you this talent, this gift. And so, work hard at it, but remember that no matter how many goals you score or don't score, no matter what people are saying about you on Twitter,
right.
You're loved by God. And so there's an interesting model there that a lot of people are using, to walk alongside young athletes and elite athletes, right? To be able to say, we don't want to get so driven by our results, to have that determine our self-worth. It's actually psychologically, it's 1,000 times healthier for us to realize that that we're loved no matter what, and that's the basis of the Christian faith. And I want to do well, but my self-worth or my ability to get into heaven isn't based on how many games I win.
Exactly.
Right. So there's a lot of that going on here, and so we're trying to find people across the country that are doing different types of work, and so some of them are Christians, like they're pastors, and they're actually helping people grow in their faith, and others, like this guy I was just talking about, who studies religion, and we had a woman on our show a couple of years ago who is a professor at William and Mary. She's an anthropologist, and she's an atheist.
Okay.
And she hates sport. But somehow she decided she was going to do research on following like athletes in action and these sports ministry groups, and following along. So she spent 2 years living with these elite women's soccer players in the U.S. who also had experiences with the chaplains from Athletes in Action. And it's just crazy. And she said, here's what's going on here. Like, they're being socialized in certain ways. They're learning certain things. So she was really researching about how Christianity informs, an elite athlete's sort of sense of self and well-being. So there's a lot of that going on too. So these events that we oversee, and Sport.Faith.Life, which is our entity with the podcast, helps to keep the conversation going between the congresses that we have every 3 years. And that's basically what it is. It's not about like faith development necessarily. It's about thinking deeply about the connections between sport and Christianity.
And speaking of the convention, when is the next one?
Next one's in 2025. So we had one this past summer in England, actually at Cambridge University, a well-known university around the world. Next one's at Baylor University in Texas, and we'll be hosted there. They have a Faith and Sports Institute there. So they have actually a lot of people. Texas is like it's part of the Bible Belt. They got all kinds of people who want to connect sport and Christianity, and so they offer a lot of classes there. They offer actually a grad program in their seminary on sport and faith. So they'll be hosting it 2025, a couple years off yet.
All right, and then let's say you were to attend this conference. What are you walking into? What do you see? What do you do? What do you hear?
Yeah. It's a knowledge-based convention. So it's very different from, it's not a church rally by any means. In fact, like I said, we'll have a lot of people that are there that are not Christians themselves, but they study Christianity.
Absolutely, yep.
There will be a lot of sports chaplains there, ministry leaders there, so pastors will be there, a lot of faculty members, so professors from different disciplines, sports coaches, athletic directors will be there, people who oversee sport organizations. So at the last couple, we've had people who are like rec directors, PE teachers at high schools or elementary schools who just kind of want to learn more. Sometimes at private schools, who just want to learn more about that. But it's something. We have journalists who show up there. Some of them are like sports editors of newspapers, or were write for magazines, whatever else. It's a wide variety of people, and so there's like, we don't want to exclude anybody,
right? Of course,
by any means. And so often, really, what happens is like, so for professors like me, when we show up to most conferences and it's just professors there, and all we talk about is our research, and it's really actually kind of boring, and nobody cares about it outside of like those people who are professors. And then there's also rallies of ministry leaders, and this is sort of trying to combine the two things, where you're pulling people from that wouldn't ordinarily talk to each other. And so the ministry leader is talking to the academic, and the academic saying, well, this is the work I've done. The ministry leader is trying to learn from that. The academic's trying to learn from what's actually going on practically on the ground. So it's that's what we're trying to do is build community where there has not been one in the past.
Okay, all right. Well, hey, you know what, Chad? I can't tell you how much I appreciate you being on the show today. Phenomenal conversation. There's a way that we do, before I let you go here, there's a way that we do end the program.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
As we mentioned, a big connection for us is basketball. I would like to know your 5 favorite basketball players of all time. Mm-hmm. Do not have to be NBA players.
Okay. That's great. I think the number one is an NBA player. I grew up just loving Michael Jordan. I have a hard time putting anyone on par with him. So he would be there. my number 2 is going to be favorite of all time. I got to say, I loved watching the Fab Five. I'm not necessarily a Michigan fan, but loved watching the Fab Five, everything that they stood for. I mean, that was great. So loved those guys. I've always really been super impressed by something about Candace Parker. That was, that's always been pretty special. And she's had a great WNBA career, but a great career at Tennessee as well. And then I'm going to go back to the history books for my other 2. So one is probably named, you don't know, Don Barksdale is the guy's name.
Do not know that name.
Don Barksdale. So the first paper I got published as a grad student in a sport history journal was about Don Barksdale, who this is the guy that grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, started playing basketball, college basketball at a community college in the mid-40s. Then he went to play at UCLA for 2 years and graduated in 1948, which means he was 1 year too young. He missed playing with Jackie Robinson on the UCLA basketball team and was 1 year too old. That he
Whoa.
Yep.
Did you say Jackie Robinson playing
played basketball at
UCLA
yep.
basketball?
Yep, you bet.
Really?
Yep. He was a multi-sport athlete there for sure. Good athlete, football, track and field, of course, baseball and basketball.
Sure.
Yeah. In fact, he played a season of semi-pro basketball in Los Angeles.
No kidding.
A little known fact about him. So Don Barksdale missed Jackie Robinson by 1 year.
Okay.
And then on the other end, so John Wooden shows up at UCLA, I think in 1949, just missed him too.
Okay.
So Don Barksdale played at UCLA for 2 years. Then he, after that, made the Olympic squad in 1948 and was the first non-white American Olympic basketball player.
Okay.
And then went on to have a career in the Industrial League, which was the equivalent of the NBA at the time. Actually was one of the first African Americans in the NBA as well. So a guy that I just have studied and have really become quite fond of. So Don Barksdale, but an all-star NBA career as well. That puts me at 4, right? So I got to have a 5th here. Don Barksdale was a big one for me. I will say probably the other one that's been really intriguing for me is a guy named Wat Misaka.
Oh,
he's a Japanese American.
Okay.
Played at University of Utah in the 1940s on their 1944 NCAA championship team. Went to Madison Square Garden and played. He's this 5'6" Japanese American guy whose family was cooped up in an internment camp during World War II. Where they were Japanese American families.
Right.
Meanwhile, he's winning the national title for Utah.
Wow.
And then the New York Knicks signed him on as a publicity stunt after he graduates, and he plays there and wasn't quite good enough to be a regular in the NBA, but a 5'6" guy that they just called this cute little fellow in the newspapers. So he's always intrigued me as well. So a nerdy answer there, but those are my 5.
And would you say that as a result of the research you did for your book, is that where you came across?
Sure. Yeah,
it's kind of cool.
All these fascinating stories. Yep, those are the 2 that come to mind.
Well, I got to tell you, when you're mentioning, these names that people might not know so much. You had one of your episodes of your podcast, you had on Sugar McLaughlin.
Yeah.
Okay, now, too young to have seen him play. He played at, was it Grand Rapids Central or Creston?
Creston, yeah.
Okay, Grand Rapids Creston, went on to a phenomenal career at Central Michigan. Too young to see him play there. But I remember watching him play in the Holland Rec League, men's Rec League. That league used to be top notch. There used to be, college players, overseas players, and I remember going to watch because it was such great basketball, and that's where I learned about Sugar McLaughlin, and it was awesome to hear his story on your podcast. So you bringing up some of these more obscure names that just popped into my head.
Yeah.
How about 5 favorite basketball movies?
I don't know if I'm going to be able to name 5. I can name a few of my favorites.
Yeah.
I don't watch a ton of movies. I know, but Will Ferrell's Semi-Pro is one of my favorites. I mean, who's not a Flint Tropics fan, right? So love that one. I'm a big fan of White Men Can't Jump, and I think it was because that was kind of like a forbidden movie for me when it came out and I was a kid. Like, it was just a little bit too adultish.
Yep.
And so finally, once I got to watch it, it was like, it was such a great movie. And I think there's just something special about the storyline there. So I like that one. Recently I was captivated by Adam Sandler's movie Hustle.
Yes.
On Netflix. Just loved that story with Juancho Hernan Gomez, and such a cool, like, I like feel good movies. That was a feel good movie,
absolutely.
definitely. And I felt like they didn't, like, the problem with some of the Adam Sandler movies is, like, he's got a lot of basketball in him, and I like that. But it's very clear that he's not as good a player as what they make him out to be in every movie that he plays, right? I mean, I know he loves playing basketball, right? When he came visit Grand Rapids a few years ago, I want to get him a pickup game and all that, which is awesome.
Yeah.
But in this one, like, he was the former player, so he didn't have to showcase his skills, and he's got that
Funky
unique looking
shot.
yeah, the funky looking shot, right? That's a nice way of putting it. So I like that movie. I like Glory Road.
Yep.
Is especially for me as a historian. I'm not a big Hoosiers fan.
No?
I mean, I don't mind the movie, but it doesn't do for me what I think it does for a lot of people. So there I've listed 4 and then a not one.
Sure. Okay. All right. Well, hey, one last question I like to end the program with is kind of something specific towards you. You're a college professor. You do a lot of research. Obviously, you've written a book. You read a lot. What are some of your favorite, if you can come up with 5, if not, no big deal, but what are, 2, 3, 4, 5 of your favorite sports books?
Yeah. I've read a ton. There's not a lot of sports books out there that sort of are intellectually based that I haven't read. So this is a good one for me. I in grad school, a couple that were favorites. One was about cricket. It's called Beyond the Boundary. Really, it's an interesting one, but not one that I spend a lot of time with now. There's one that was called Soccer and Sun and Shadow, which is actually written by a journalist from Latin America, a guy from, I think he's Brazilian, but he makes fun at, like, all the political happenings throughout the history of the World Cup, and so that's kind of it's a fun one. But I would say probably my favorite one is called Heaven is a Playground, and it was written by a guy named Rick Thielander, who's also a journalist, who basically spent 2 years, gave up his lifestyle as a white journalist and moved into, I think it was Brooklyn, basically living in the projects and going to, like, playground basketball courts every day and getting a sense for the culture.
Sure.
And really getting in on with some of these players who have big dreams and following their lives as they try to get out of Brooklyn and make something of themselves through basketball based on, like, the playground game. So Heaven is a Playground is one of my favorites. That's just I'm going to stop with that one because that's such a great book, and it's so easy to read, and it's such a great story. This is coming from the late 70s, early 80s.
Was there a movie?
Yeah.
Was the movie, I don't have the same title, was it based on the book?
Yeah,
okay.
It was.
All right.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yep. So I guess maybe that's a crossover answer for me. I haven't seen the movie, but I love the book. I love the study that the guy did. I loved how it gets in depth with some of these players. So that's probably my favorite one.
All right, Chad. Well, again, thanks a lot. Hey, where can people find your book, and where can people find your podcast?
Yeah, my book was written through the University of Arkansas Press, so that it's on their website, but also Amazon or any other bookseller you'll be able to find Making March Madness. Sport.Faith.Life.com then is a place where you find our website, and our podcast is on Apple, Spotify, any of those locations, but Sport.Faith.Life.com is the place. All
right, Chad. Well, hey, thank you so much. We'll have to get you back again to talk more, sports, faith, or anything at all. Love to have you again.
Thanks so much, Kurt. Appreciate it.